there's been a paradigm shift in the leadership themselves where it's the authority rests with us. We don't work for the conference works for us. And that is just totally kind of out of step historically with how the Senate's been run. The leadership is elected, right? And they are supposed to represent the interests of the conference. They're supposed to work for the conference. They're not supposed to take a minority of the conference and go vote with the Democrats and ignore the wishes of the rest of their colleagues. And that's traditionally now how things are done. And we've seen that a lot this year. And there was a quote from McConnell, a couple of months ago. I think the biggest hurdle that anyone replacing him has is to overcome this quote from McConnell, which was effectively, I'm not quoting it perfectly, but it was, I'm not worried about who's going to replace me because all of them are exactly like me.
Howdy everyone and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
For yet another fantastic episode this week, we had back on a very early guest of this show who was otherwise disposed for the last year because she was the executive director of the Senate Steering Committee. But before I get to that, I think you can still buy tickets for the gala for American Statecraft. It's a little touch and go. There might be none left. There might be like 2 left. So if you really want to come and pay $1,000 to be part of the most awesome gala that's going to happen in DC this year, you can do that. Go to americanmoment.org/gala. And if you can't make it, but you want to support our work anyway, go to americanmoment.org/donate. You can also find everything else we have cooking at our organization at americanmoment.org. That's, for instance, AM Fridays, the lecture series we're doing this spring on Capitol Hill in the Russell Senate office building. We had a really good turnout for the first few weeks and want to keep that momentum up. So you can sign up on the interest form there. It's americanmoment.org/AM Fridays. I believe you can apply for a fall fellowship for American Statecraft. Spring and summer are obviously closed. And if not, there might be an interest form or something. There's stuff on the website. Go check it out. There's the backlog of this show. We always have fantastic stuff cooking there. But this week we had back on, I think, guest number 2, maybe 3, someone who has been a friend of and a mentor to American Moment since the very beginning. In fact, before the beginning, Rachel Bovard, who is newly returned as the Vice President of Programs at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She spent over a decade on Capitol Hill in various capacities in the House and Senate, including as legislative director to Senator Rand Paul. She most recently served as the executive director of the Senate Steering Committee, the caucus of conservative senators chaired by Senator Mike Lee. In 2013, Rachel was named to National Journal's list of the 35 most influential women in Washington under 35. I'm pretty sure some of those caveats can be removed. She's just one of the most influential people in Washington, period, as far as we're concerned. Rachel's policy analysis and punditry have appeared widely on print and television, including in The Federalist, The New York Times, Fox News, MSNBC, and The New York Post, among other outlets. Along with CPI's chairman Jim DeMint, she's the co-author of Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. She serves on the advisory board of American Moment and the board of the American Conservative magazine. We had this incredible discussion with her, talking about all these big inflection point fights that just happened in the Senate over the course of the last year. Ukraine, the border deal falling apart, what a post-Mitch McConnell world could look like, how the conservative senators are starting to grow a spine, big tech, the net choice case, and much more. I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. What did you think, Nick?
Rachel is the absolute expert when it comes to basically anything Senate related. So I sit my tail down and listen and just let her talk.
Yeah.
She knows a lot.
Yeah, and she's really quite cool as a cucumber a lot of the time. And part of that is because of something we talked about in the members only section, which was about her wine hobby. She's like, I think about to be or is already a master sommelier. And so if you'd like to hear about that, her doomsday predictions, and a crazy story about a banana and Nick being on his knees in Charlotte Airport, you can become a paid member of the Moment of Truth podcast on our YouTube channel. There's 2 tiers, Truthers and Statesmen, and that gives you access to the episode 24 hours early, gives you access to special members only content like these bonus segments we're doing, as well as in-person events and other perks. So a bunch of you already signed up. Basically, our goal is to eventually make this podcast self-sufficient through subscriptions, and based on the highly devoted listenership of the show, we think we can do it. So be a part of that. It's, trivial amounts of money. A bunch of you have expense accounts. You can do it. But it really really does help us keep this show going and keep providing that fantastic content to you. You know, one of the ways that I think that Rachel stays cool as a cucumber is through her wine hobby. It certainly takes the edge off at the end of a long day. But what is one to do if it's Lent, for instance, and you're not drinking? Well, the thing I use on a daily basis to actually stay calm, collected, and you can see the discrepancy when I'm not in town and don't have it on me, is Magic Mind. These little green shots, you take them in the morning with coffee and they really help even out the effects of caffeine. They're full of amazing ingredients like matcha, agave, passion fruit, olive oil, ashwagandha, a bunch of crazy stuff in there that really helps even the effects of stimulants. For those of you who've decided to add on other stimulants into your daily routine, like you Lucy and Zen people, I'm sure it helps with that as well. But Magic Mind is a great partner to this show, and because of our listeners' loyalty, you can get a discount at magicmind.com/truth20, or you can just enter the discount code truth20. That's magicmind.com/truth20 for these little green shots that'll really help zero in and dial in your focus for the day, help make sure that coffee doesn't turn you into a jittery tyrant. We can't recommend them enough. We'll go now to Rachel Bovard. Rachel, welcome back to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
You were like episode 2 or 3 or something, and now we're at like episode 144. In the meantime, you were elsewhere. We couldn't have you on any public media. Tell our audience what you were up to for the last year.
Yeah, so I was back in the Senate. I was running the Senate Steering Committee as the executive director, which is the caucus of the conservative Republican senators. So it's chaired by Mike Lee. I actually worked at the steering committee in my last capacity in the Senate, but this time came back as the executive director. So really just responsible for cultivating strategy with those conservative senators, moving their priorities forward. I think we had success, right? I don't want to take, it's really their decision whether we did or not, but I had a blast being back.
Yeah, it looked like they were having a lot of fun over the last year and like actually flexing their muscles and doing stuff. Can you explain just a little bit about, people are very familiar with the House Freedom Caucus, especially after this last year, and what they do very practically. What are the kinds of things that the Senate Steering Committee does that are particular to the dynamics of the Senate as compared to the House?
Yeah, it's a good question because the Senate, the House is very majoritarian. So what the House Freedom Caucus does, its power is in its members voting in a block, right? When you can present, especially in this narrow majority, when you can present a group of votes, you have a tremendous amount of leverage. The Senate is completely different because in the Senate, individual senators are incredibly powerful in a way that individual House members are not. So setting aside majority or minority in the Senate, individual senators in both parties have a tremendous amount of authority, and the Senate rules are constructed in that way. So a lot of what we did was to maximize the senators, the rights that they have on the floor. And you saw that come out in a number of ways, most notably Roger Marshall, senator from Kansas, making what is called a rogue motion to proceed. Under the rules, any senator can decide that they want to consider anything, any bill, and move to it on the floor. Now, traditionally, that authority is deferred to the majority or the minority leader. Traditionally, in this instance, the majority leader, which is Chuck Schumer. But Roger Marshall found an opening on the floor to proceed to the House-passed Israel bill and get a vote on that. And I don't think that's been done in at least 30 years.
And talk to me about the dynamics of that, because that Israel bill was important because it pulled out the Ukraine funding and some of the other priorities that the establishment in both parties wanted. So if something like that had passed, it would have given up a lot of their political leverage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Because at the time and recently, the bills that the Senate and the House were considering was Ukraine aid coupled with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, including Israel aid, including aid to Taiwan, including all these other priorities, Red Sea priorities that other people wanted. The idea being we were, or the establishment was unsure if their main priority, Ukraine, could pass by itself. So you want to couple it with all these popular things. The House had passed, in the wake of October 7th, a standalone package of Israel aid offset with the increase in IRS funding. The Senate had declared that a non-starter, but the point still stood, right? Senate Republicans should be forcing a vote on this. This is an important issue for a lot of them. For a lot of people that thought the Ukraine issue should be debated on its own merits, they had no problem moving Israel aid by itself. And so it was actually kind of amazing timing because that day, Chuck Schumer had been down on the Mall. There was a huge Israel rally, and he had been telling the crowd, we're going to pass Israel aid. Nothing is going to stop us from doing that. And then he had to come back to the Senate and vote against Israel aid. So it was pretty fun. The senators had a great time. And it just goes to show, I think the most important exercise, there was a political exercise, but the ability of those senators to actually use their rights. And I think that's been some of the dysfunction in the Senate conference, both conferences to some extent, is that the power senators have has been so muted and so subverted. And it's like, why would you kill yourself to get up here, spend millions of dollars, put your family life on hold to just sit around and be told how to vote? Right? Rather than actually using the rights abrogated to you under the rules of the Senate. And so that was a lot of my job. The other really important thing the Senate Steering Committee does is they run the Wednesday conference lunch. Now, the Republican conference meets for lunch 3 times a week. On Tuesday, and that's the Republican Policy Committee lunch. That's sort of a leadership agenda. Wednesday's the steering lunch. And then Thursday, individual members of the Senate bring food from their home state. And it's kind of like a social lunch. But why this is important is because the lunches are where things are hammered out in the conference. Conference decisions are made. People get to talk about.
There's no staff in there.
There's no staff. Well, there's a handful of staff in each lunch, depending on who's hosting. So we ran the Wednesday lunch, the steering lunch. So I was in that lunch with a handful of leadership staff. And the steering committee crafts that agenda. And so that's a time for the conservative senators to say, this is what we want to talk about. And it's interesting. Senator Ted Cruz has a podcast called Verdict, where he gets into this. His episode on the border deal, he talks about the dynamics of these lunches. And it's worth listening to because I think it's a really underappreciated part of how the Senate operates, because the Democrats do the same thing. And in these lunches, this is where things get hammered out. And a lot of decisions are made. A lot of the mean girl dynamics that operate the Senate get meted out in these lunches. So that is a critical part of what the steering committee is able to do, is set an agenda that isn't leadership controlled. And it's important, right? It's important because it's not just members of the steering committee often that want to talk about these things. It's other members of the conference as well.
You were talking a minute ago about, senators having this kind of being muted, basically, not advocating for their own interests or the interest of their constituents. When did that start to become the case? How did that all come about? Is it a Mitch McConnell specific thing, or does it go back further than that?
So in my experience, it really began under Harry Reid, who was the former Democratic leader, and his belief that voting was toxic, that voting was politically dangerous and the Senate should do less of it. And it didn't start, it didn't go from 0 to 100 immediately. I mean, even you go back to the Reid days, and this is when I worked in the Senate last time, the floor was still much more robust and alive than it is today. But it was this slow squeeze. It was his belief that he should be able to control almost absolutely what came to the floor and how it came to the floor. And that is how the House operates, right? There is a body that works like that. It is called the House.
Yeah.
The Senate is designed almost the opposite, right? It's an incredibly empowered minority, and individual senators can use their power to demand votes on amendments, to, move to proceed to bills on the calendar. It is not supposed to be in the purview of one person or one party to decide how the floor operates. But it was this slow squeeze by Harry Reid, and that was when you first saw the first nuclear option. People talk about it as being the 2013 nuclear option, which was on nominations generally. But the first one was really in 2011 when he nuked the motion to suspend, which was a way in which senators were getting around his stranglehold on amendments. They were using a specific procedure to say, all right, you're going to block me in this avenue. Fine, I'll use the rules under Rule 22 to get 10 minutes before the vote and, make a motion to suspend the rule so I can offer the amendment I want to offer. He nuked that. And when you start to do that, and just to unpack what the nuclear option is, there are the Senate's rules, and then there are Senate's precedents. And if you think about the Senate's rules as sort of the architecture of the Senate, the skeleton of the Senate, the precedents are the muscle, right? The rules, they're vague, kind of. They're actually pretty short. They're only 70 pages for the whole Senate. But the precedents...
70 pages of rules is short.
Well, I mean, when people tend to think about the Senate rules, they think you always hear the words Byzantine and arcane, right? Yeah. So that's really the precedents. There's over 1 million precedents that govern how the rules are applied. So what the nuclear option does and why it's called that is that it sets up a precedent that's in violation of the Senate's rules. So the Senate's rules don't change. So for instance, with the judicial filibuster, the Senate's rules still say it takes 60 votes to end cloture on a nomination. But the precedent says, no, it's only 51. And so it almost makes the rules worthless because you have every time the Senate confirms a nomination with 51 votes or invokes cloture with 51 votes, it's violating its own rule. It's nonsensical. Mm-hmm. It's not a way to run a body. And the reason they do it that way is because to change a rule in the Senate, you can change a rule, but it takes 67 votes, right? It's a much higher threshold. To change a precedent only takes a majority.
So I've been wanting to ask you about this anyway, and this podcast is a great venue to do it. I recently finished reading Master of the Senate, right, about LBJ and his time as majority leader. What do you think has changed? You know, it's truly impressive, like the way that he ran the Senate at the time. So from then versus now, I guess I'm asking you to broaden a little bit, like pre-2011, what's changed?
I think part of it is the culture of the Senate. You have LBJ really had to work for it, right? Like he was kind of tyrannical in the way that he ran the Senate, right? But he had to work for it. There was a lot of horse trading. There was a lot of arm twisting. There was bullying. And you still see a little bit of that in the Senate. But members, I think, themselves, you've almost reached, and I can only speak for the Republican side of the Senate, but it's almost like you've reached a critical mass in the conference of members who don't understand it's not supposed to be that way. So they're very docile, right? They think the job, and to be candid, probably many of them want the job to be this way, right? Where you go in and you just go to lunch and you go to your fundraiser and you just wait for, the missive to come down from on high of how you should vote and what you should do. And they don't assert themselves. Whereas I think in LBJ's day, you had senators that realized like the committee chairs were incredibly powerful, right? And LBJ style tactics are a way to run the Senate, but it requires, active work. It requires, trades to be made, rights to be respected. And that doesn't really exist anymore in the Senate. It's just, if you don't do what we want, the leadership says, then we'll punish you on the campaign trail, or we'll shame you at lunch or else. And I think the nuclear option has really precipitated that slide because nobody has to work for it anymore, right? Like if you have 51 votes, you're not working for anything. You're just scheduling votes, right? Like the whip operation isn't nearly as robust as it used to be. There's no appreciation for members who actually have like various thoughts on this and how can we deal with you and what can we give you and how can we come to a negotiated settlement. And also I think what's changed too is that there's been a paradigm shift in the leadership themselves where it's the authority rests with us. We don't work for the conference works for us. And that is just totally kind of out of step historically with how the Senate's been run. The leadership is elected, right? And they are supposed to represent the interests of the conference. They're supposed to work for the conference. They're not supposed to take a minority of the conference and go vote with the Democrats and ignore the wishes of the rest of their colleagues. And that's traditionally now how things are done. And we've seen that a lot this year.
So something else that I think we've seen this year and in both chambers is how relatively easy it is to change the culture back. I think there was a tweet by Senator Eric Schmidt a couple of weeks ago. I'm forgetting the details of it, but it was something like, every senator that's been here less than X time or under this age voted a certain way on a certain issue. And there does seem to be a generational change in the guard that's making these guys a little bit more bold, a little bit more willing to take some slings and arrows to do the right thing. What have you seen on that front? Does it feel like, every new senator we get on the Republican side, it's probably going to be more bold, more aggressive rather than the status quo?
I do think that there is a definite generational divide shaping up in the Republican conference. And Senator Schmidt really did point this out. It was on the Ukraine supplemental vote. You know, he said most of the people that voted for it were over 55 and no one under that age. I think I would have to go back and fact check that, but I don't think it was anyone under 55 voted for it. And, you know, in some ways this makes sense. I mean, this was the culture and the generation raised by 9/11. Raised by the failures in the Iraq War, raised by the failures of the defense establishment again and again and again. And now they're asking, why would we continue to trust you when you haven't made the case? You know, all you've said is literally trust us. Well, we don't. Right. And I think that there is a line of demarcation within the conference. And this is probably true of the Democrats, too, to some extent, that, you know, you have this old guard, and on the right, it's represented by Mitch McConnell, the old Cold Warrior. And I do think McConnell sees his legacy. And, you know, this has been widely speculated in the press on as maintaining this point of view that it is America, of the American empire, right? The American empire exists, and it is our duty to defend and protect it, however, you know, orders of magnitude far away something is from our direct interest. And there's just not that belief is just not widely shared anymore. And I think that's why you saw when he forced that Ukraine vote, well, worked with Chuck Schumer on that Ukraine vote, you know, months we had been talking about this, and it had been clear to everyone, you know, outside and inside, that this was McConnell's biggest priority, and he couldn't even muster half the Republican conference to support it.
Tell me that story of that vote specifically. What was the dynamics in the conference, and what does it tell us about where things are trending? I mean, the way that people were talking about it seemed like this quantum moment where McConnell's hold had broken. Do you think that's overstated?
No, but I think it actually happened before that. There was a moment in September when we were considering a short-term funding bill, a continuing resolution. And the American Conservative has written about this moment, I think, probably the most comprehensively. But there was McConnell and Schumer were really pushing to say, okay, we're going to do this short-term CR, but it has to have this Ukraine money on it. And the rest of the conference wasn't sold on this. And it was interesting because the day of the vote was a Saturday, and you saw in the House Hakeem Jeffries, who's the Democrat minority leader, filibustering. And I say that with air quotes because you can't actually filibuster in the House, but he was using his leadership priority basically to do a magic minute. And that's just talk at length to be able to say, to, you know, to give the Senate time to try to pass this plussed up CR with Ukraine. And the senators went into a conference meeting. I think it was like, you know, a lunch basically. You know, I wasn't in there and the leadership staff were. When they came out of that lunch, you know, McConnell went in there to make the case, we have to do this with Ukraine. And decisively, the conference was like, yeah, Mitch, we hear you, but no. We don't have the case for this. The House isn't going to pass this with Ukraine money. Why can't we just, you know, pass the CR? And I think it was a moment when, you know, the case, one, hadn't been made, but two, he was clinging to this Ukraine aid in a way that was so irrational that it just didn't resonate with the rest of the conference. And I've never seen that before. I've never seen, most people will in the conference, I think, defer to McConnell, or that's how it's been done for the last, you know, how many decades. But they didn't. They refused. And he had to course correct in the moment in a way that I've never seen before. And so I think that was when people were like, okay, you know, McConnell's grip on the conference on this particular issue isn't nearly as solid as everybody's been assuming. And I think you saw that then reflect in how the debate went forward on the Ukraine issue. And that, you know, was complicated with the border deal and all this kind of stuff. But it was a lot.
Yeah. So let's talk about that border deal, because I think it's just one of those things that for people who are not super plugged into Washington, it's utterly baffling to watch. How on earth do we get to the point where this absolutely atrocious deal was even offered to begin with? What on earth is going on in the psychology of leadership with it? I think that this is palatable at all. And how is the resistance to it successfully marshaled?
So this, I think, again, demonstrates how the current dynamic of how the leadership runs the conference, I just don't think is sustainable. Because it is true that, you know, when it became clear that we're going to have to consider this Ukraine supplemental, which, by the way, a supplemental spending bill is like, you know, in addition to appropriations. the Congress hasn't even finished FY24 appropriations, but they already passed an emergency extra, which just as a process person annoys the crap out of me. But anyway, that aside. So when it became clear there were going to be this request for a supplemental, you had members of the conference, especially conservatives, say, why, we need to be doing something for our southern border. It is overrun. It is an invasion. This is, topping the charts, astronomical crossings. This is a problem. This has to be part of the deal. And McConnell, to his credit, was like, okay. But then he, selected James Langford to be the face of that deal, to be the primary point negotiating with Democrats. But there was no one else involved. And I think that is the key problem, because there were members of the conference that really wanted to be involved in this negotiation, that had very clear priorities for what that border deal should look like. And that is why Senator Ron Johnson kept calling conference meetings. So under the rules of the conference, it only takes 5 members to sign a letter to say, we would like to have a conference meeting. And that's when the conference gets together to discuss these priorities outside of the traditional lunch format. He kept calling these conference meetings to talk about the border, to talk about Ukraine, because there were members of the conference that were like, no, it has to say this. Like, if you're negotiating on our behalf, this is what we want to see. And that input was completely ignored, right? To the point where, like, it was almost laughable. Like, were we ever even in the room? Did their concerns ever even, like, reach the threshold of discussion? And it seems like not, because the product that was put out was just woefully insufficient on any number of metrics, including just basic securing the border, including parole reform, including a host of other issues. And I think what's really telling about it was that the House, you've seen some of the moderates in the House put out this border deal with Democrats. What the House moderates were able to get Democrats to agree to in like a couple of weeks, they got them to agree to remain in Mexico. Apparently remain in Mexico is now a moderate Republican position. Yeah. And the Republican senators working for 4 months with Democrats got completely rolled and couldn't even get that kind of gain. And so, of course, it was insufficient. But I think what was really stunning about it was the politics of how it all played out. When McConnell and Langford also said this, on the Sunday shows, blamed the Republican conference, their own colleagues, for just being captured by Trump.
Yeah.
And
MAGA influencers.
Right. And I just thought that was so insulting to these members who had put so much time and sweat equity and legislative proposals forward for what they wanted to see. And then just to be like, to brush it off and say, well, they're just Trump captured. Like, what? But then McConnell voted against the deal, too. So.
Yeah. What did the final tally end up being in the deal?
There were 4 Republicans that voted for it.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it failed because it just wasn't good enough.
Why do you think there were? I mean, there's more moderate Republican senators than that. Why do you think it didn't get 60 votes?
Because it was a bad deal.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is the most high profile issue for Republican voters, Trump or not.
Yeah.
And by the way, why would Trump want to sign onto a deal that effectively tied his hands? Mm-hmm. Right? That limited his ability when he took office to be able to impose border controls. Why would he sign on to that? But in my there were, they say that the party was captured by Trump. Multiple senators came out who opposed the deal who said, I never talked to Trump about this. Right? I just think it was so insulting to the work these senators put in to just brush them off as this was just election year politics. No, it's not. This is the top issue for Republican voters, and it has to be addressed in a substantive way. And this bill didn't even secure the border on day one. So at the end of the day, it was an easy call.
Do you think that the result of the negotiations was just bad politics, or was the bill intentionally that bad?
I think it was really hampered, and I think, Senator Langford did the best that he could with the hand he was dealt, right? But I think what really hampered that deal from the start was that the leadership was unwilling to walk away from the table. You are always going to get rolled on a deal in which you're not willing to walk away. And Democrats walked away 3 times. They walked away 3 times, and Republicans were like, no, we'll counter our offer 3 separate times to get you back to the table. Of course you're going to get rolled in that situation. And there's another dynamic too that Rosemary Jenks, who runs the Immigration Accountability Project, points out when it comes to immigration negotiations. And that is that every time Republicans try to negotiate this stuff with Democrats, Democrats bring immigration attorneys to the table whose entire careers have been, exploiting asylum loopholes, getting people across the border illegally. They are professionals. On the right, we have immigration policy people who are great and wonderful, but they're not that level of attorney. And so Democrats are trying to get Republicans to agree to all sorts of sleights of hand that we just miss. And it's never worked out in our favor. And that was a dynamic at work here too, I think, is just that we didn't have the same level of expertise and gamesmanship that the left brought to the table. So we always get rolled in immigration fights. But again, unless the problem with that whole negotiation from the beginning was that the border was never the priority. Ukraine was the priority. And we were never willing to abandon it. And until we were willing to do that, there was no way this was going to end well.
Can you explain to me why Republican senators care so much about Ukraine? Like, what's going on there?
So, I mean, I think the American people look at what's going on in Ukraine and feel badly about it, right? Like, nobody supports the level of human suffering that is happening there. No one supports tyrannical aggression from dictators like Vladimir Putin. What they don't support is this no holds barred, sort of almost like slavish adoration of, this priority, and regardless of anything else. And I think that's the mistake the pro-Ukraine advocates make is, Mitt Romney coming to the Senate floor and saying the vote on this Ukraine supplemental is the most important vote senators will ever take. Like, are you kidding me? Is that more important than, well, clearly he thinks so. Is it more important than the border? Is it more important than reforming our terrible healthcare system? Is it more important than, making sure Americans' elections are like vibrant and secure? Like, is it more important than all these things? And I think there's people that actually think that. And so I think, but it harkens back to this old mentality of, I don't need to justify myself to you. And that's the foreign policy blob in Washington. And it's been operating under that assumption for the last 20 years. And there's just people that don't believe it anymore. I think people can be brought around on the Ukraine argument, but make your case. And no, it's not that, 38 states are going to get arms manufacturing from this aid to Ukraine. Like, that argument is immoral. I'm sorry.
This has been just one of the most risible things I've ever seen. You have like these losers like Mark Thiessen like going around saying like, actually, real populists would support Ukraine aid because it brings jobs to Alabama. It's like, what's wrong with you? Like, it's
like you should support this because blood money. Like that is so offensive, I think, to the conscience of every American who's like, oh, and you heard McConnell say this. Well, no, Americans are dying in Ukraine. No, but people are dying. Babies are dying. Men are being conscripted off the street and forced to go to the front because what they have is not really a weapons problem. It's a bodies problem, right? They don't have enough people to fight this war. And we're just not, I think, especially my generation, the elder millennial, someone called us Xennials the other day. We grew up in this. We saw our classmates like believe, that Iraq was worth fighting and then watch it all go to shreds and watch them die in the desert for nothing. And so we just aren't sold on this. And I don't think the foreign policy blob has caught up to that you have to make the case. And I don't think the case for Ukraine and the national interest is that solid, particularly when you have Europe, who's right there. And by the way, you know what else increases our defense industrial base? Europe buying weapons from us.
So all of these fights have, been somewhat white pilling because it's shown that a lot of Republican senators have grown a spine and are willing to say no to this. But the overall numbers, certainly if you count Democrats, don't look super hot. What should people be thinking about and watching out for as we roll up to the eve of potentially having a conservative president again, about how Congress will try to stymie all the different kinds of reform that the president might want to see done?
Well, I think this Ukraine bill was a perfect example. Senator J.D. Vance pointed this out. Like, he called it an impeachment trap. But basically, the whole bill was structured that it was a future appropriations for Ukraine for the next, 2 or 3 years, which ties the hands of a future Republican administration legally. And, Vance's point was essentially, we appropriate this money. If Trump decides not to spend it, that's exactly what they impeached him for the last time. That is what they will impeach him for again. And, there are multiple quotes in the New York Times and others from people in the administration saying, oh, yes, we're trying to future proof, right? We're trying to build in controls to tie the hands of the next executive if it doesn't go our way. And I think you are going to see those Easter eggs, in funding bills, in, all kinds of things.
And didn't a McConnell staffer say to the Times or something, that's a MAGA conspiracy theory?
Yeah. And I just it literally happened, my dude.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, it's a future fact because it's a past fact.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Biden administration views Ukraine as part of their legacy as well, if they're this concerned about tying the hands of a future president?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also just think the left has this religious devotion to the cause, which I cannot claim to understand.
Yeah.
And I think it's become it's like a virtue signaling element to what they do now, that it's just feeds into everything else.
Yeah. But going back to how the Republican Senate or House could stymie a future president, I mean, even during the last Trump administration, you were one of the few people saying that even the Just So story about judges and appointees wasn't all that. And McConnell was actually quite slow and quite ineffective when it came to getting that done. Well, stare into the future for us. What are these fights going to be next time?
I mean, I think it depends, obviously, on the makeup of the Congress. But I mean, the Senate during the Biden administration, I think, has lapped the McConnell record on judicial confirmations. There's been no, Supreme Court, so you can put that as a feather in McConnell's cap. But Biden has gotten more judges, I think, at a faster pace than anyone else. So I do think, I think it depends too. I think the leadership of the Senate Republican Conference may change in the future. So I think how that is handled determines how some of these fights will be handled. Because if it is just a choice of, okay, we're just going to confirm noms, for the entirety of the Republican election, I mean, okay, that's a choice, but you're effectively saying the legislature is irrelevant, and everything that's going to be done policy-wise in Washington under a Republican president is going to be done by the executive branch. It's a choice. And they'll say, oh, well, we might not have 60 votes. Well, this goes back to what we were saying about LBJ. I don't know, work for it, right? Work for it. And also, yes, force Democrats to vote down some of these priorities. Why wouldn't you put these bills on the floor? People need to see the distinction between Republicans and Democrats in Washington. And I think the constant frustration, at least among Republican senators, and I think the base, is that particularly in the Senate, you can't really tell the difference. All the headlines about this funding fight have been McConnell and Schumer this. McConnell and Schumer agree that. And Mike Johnson's on the outs with McConnell and Schumer. Well, why isn't it McConnell and Johnson on the outs with Chuck Schumer?
Yeah.
Rewrite some of those lines. That's what I think Republican voters want to see.
Is there an equivalent to Tax Cut and Jobs Act this time around, the thing that's going to suck up all the oxygen as an establishment priority? Is something like that percolating yet, or is there not going to be a corollary? I
assume that will be. There's part of it is because of the vehicle of reconciliation, right? If you get budget reconciliation, it is the one vehicle where you can do fairly substantive things with just a majority threshold, but it's limited. The rules in the Senate limit it pretty much to taxes.
Yeah.
Now, we did manage to, when I was working in the Senate, not this time, but the last time, successfully argue to the parliamentarian that some of Obamacare could be repealed with reconciliation. And if you remember, we did this exercise in 2015. It was a test run for a Republican president. But when Trump took office, the same vote, there were a number of Republican senators that flipped. So you can do healthcare reform and things like that in reconciliation. I would love to see that. I would love to see Republicans engage on some of the healthcare fights, reforming some of the system. I don't have high hopes. But yeah.
I think this is the first I've heard a conservative talk about healthcare probably since that last vote.
Yeah, it's like that Star Wars meme. I haven't heard that name in a very long time.
Yeah,
look,
repeal and replace.
I really hate healthcare policy. I'd rather gouge my eye out with a rusty nail than to do healthcare policy. Yeah. But it is the case that, it is a structural area of desperate need in this country. Obamacare was a failure. Yeah. So how are we fixing it?
Health savings accounts.
Is there even anyone good in the conservative movement on this issue? I actually don't know.
Chris Jacobs has always been my guiding star on this issue. He has a very libertarian approach to healthcare reform. There are other people that say, look, the system is in place. We have to work within the system. So I think that's something the Republican Party, like those two approaches, I think can be complementary to some extent. But I think the Republican Party is still trying to work out kind of which way it goes in that direction too.
You mentioned that the Senate might have new leadership in the coming years. Peel back the curtain for us. What does that process look like? In like the MAGA commentariat or whatever, like people will just like say things like Rand Paul for majority leader, and like that'd be great, but like how's this actually going to go? What's the timeline that people are expecting it to go on? Who are the players? Tell us about it.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I have no inside information about this.
Yeah.
I'm purely speculating off the comment that McConnell made when asked about this. And his statement was, "I will serve out the remainder of my term as leader," and his term as leader is up this coming November, effectively. Under the conference rules, the election shouldn't be held until January 2025, but they traditionally do it kind of in that interim between the election and the swearing in of the new Congress. He may run again. I don't know. But there is a lot of obviously public speculation that there are 3 senators running to replace him, colloquially the 3 Johns, right?
This is Barrasso, Thune, and Cornyn.
Correct. Yeah. John Thune already serves as the whip. Barrasso as the conference chair, and then Cornyn is out of leadership at the moment, but was formerly whip. Because you have to understand in the Republican Senate conference, every position in the leadership is term limited except the leader. The leader can serve forever if they keep electing him. The other positions get term limited out. So
perfectly designed for a leader to keep all their power and prevent anyone else from accumulating enough power to challenge them.
Something like that. Yeah. But should McConnell step down, say he does, and there's an open race to replace him, I mean, and he can be challenged, right? He has to be reelected every Congress. And you saw at the beginning of the last Congress, Senator Rick Scott from Florida mount a challenge to McConnell, which I think was the first one.
And how many
all of his
senators
16
voted
years
against McConnell?
So it is a secret ballot. And this occurs. So how the voting takes place is like in a conference meeting. So behind closed doors, secret ballot. So we don't actually know.
Like people write on a piece of paper. And
they write on a piece of paper. They hand it into the conference chair. So it would be Barrasso running this conference. He's assisted by the floor secretary for that particular. So if it's the Republicans, it would be the floor secretary for the minority, who's a man named Robert Duncan, and he manages the floor for McConnell. So he would be assisting in this process, but they count those votes and then they announce the total. Now, so we don't know exactly. It's speculative that Rick Scott received 10 votes against Mitch McConnell, but you can't really confirm it. So if there is a contested election, so let's say there's multiple candidates running, that process is, again, secret ballot, but it's repeat balloting until you get to a majority. And the loser of each round drops out at the end. So if there's like 5 candidates running, all 5 will get a vote. The lowest vote getter of those 5 drops out. We go to a next round. It's only 4.
So in that room, like there will be vote totals on the wall or whatever in a scenario where there's more than 2. Got it.
Yeah. And every position is handled that way. Like if you have a contested ballot for the conference chair or the whip, in the last decade or so, probably longer, right? There's been sort of this acclamation, right? Everybody just knows John Barrasso has served as conference chair, so he will be elevated to the whip. But technically, all those positions are open for anyone to run.
Talk to me about like what's the overlapping Venn diagram of the good and the possible in a scenario like this. One concept that I think is talked a lot in our circles about is the idea that sometimes the most sort of putatively conservative member might not be the best leadership position appointee because it sort of dampens the ability for conservatives to criticize them and it gives them a long leash. How are you thinking about the dynamics when it comes to that kind of thing?
My feeling, and I think I'm not speaking for like conservative senators, but my feeling is that they do the best when they're not in the leadership positions, right? Like they want to be able to critique the system. They want to be able to maintain the ability to, not vote for these things or shut the process down to make sure their voices are included. So from a Senate perspective, I think, that's why the steering committee exists, right? The steering committee exists to make sure that the perspectives of conservatives are included in the debate. And they have a tremendous amount of power to be able to do that. Again, going back to the rights that senators themselves possess. And I do think it's hard for, a conservative to ascend to leadership, because then, and Mike Johnson's a perfect example, right? You're forced to shill for all the things that you formerly hated, right? Because that's the responsibility to some extent. Mm-hmm. Now, I think you have a tremendous, the flip side of that is you have a lot of authority to make those changes, right? Like Mike Johnson may believe he has to pass these government funding bills, but he doesn't have to, right? And so it depends how you view the burden of leadership and if you actually want to change and alter the status quo, or you want to sort of become a creature of it with marginal gains on the outside.
So the two axes to these conversations is always policy and process. There were conversations in the sort of kumbaya period after McCarthy finally won the speakership last year, where you would hear Freedom Caucus members talking about amazing conversations they were having with Problem Solvers Caucus members, saying like, man, this is so great. We feel like real House members again. And they were actually enjoying the process of getting to be legislators. Is there any sense that there's a similar sort of cross ideological desire in the Senate Republican conference to be real senators again? Or is it much more divided between the conservatives and the moderates?
It's interesting. I haven't seen, I would say the Democrat senators are much more in lockstep with their leadership than the Republican senators. And it was funny. A reporter told me one time that, going back to the lunches, and that's where everything gets hashed out. He said, oh yeah, Republicans leak like crazy out of their lunches. He's like, Democrats don't do that. And that kind of tells you about the vibe, right? And this goes back to how the lunches are used. Leadership leaks out of those lunches all the time, very specific narratives to target individual senators. You saw this with Tommy Tuberville over and over and over again when he was holding up nominations over the DOD abortion policy. They just kept bludgeoning him. And Punchbowl and Politico exist to do that bidding, right? The Capitol Hill press has that relationship with McConnell because if they write something or, spin a narrative that he doesn't like, he cuts off their access. So their whole business model is based on reporting certain narratives and shaping them.
Can you talk a little bit more about the function that the Capitol Hill press play, Punchbowl and Politico, Axios, some of these other places? What exactly is that sort of parasitic relationship they have with Republican leadership, and what do people not understand about how that actually works?
So the Capitol Hill press has a very limited audience, and it is the 535 members of Congress. So you have to look at it like that. They're not really speaking outside the Beltway, right? My parents don't read Politico and Punchbowl, right? It is a very limited audience, but their entire business model is based around access, right? They want scoops. They want to look like they are in the know. That really comes from the leadership operation. And McConnell in particular spends a lot of time on this, in my experience, on shaping what narratives the Capitol Hill press put out. And so a lot of what the spin is from these guys is from a very specific leadership angle. They will rarely report on the conservative perspective. Even if asked, they will not do it. And there's a reason for that, because again, that access is dangled out there, right? You want the scoop, you want the inside story, then fine, this is what you need to say. And look, it's how they make money, right? You begrudge them that or not, it drives me crazy, but this is how they do that. And, the conservative movement, I think, really suffers from the fact that they don't have the same Capitol Hill beat reporting that these guys do, because to be off the Senate floor, to be outside the lunches, to be anywhere in the Capitol subway hallways and all of that, you have to be credentialed from the press gallery. But the press gallery credentialing operation is controlled by the very people who want to keep out, people that they disagree with.
Yeah, it's a cartel.
Correct.
Yeah. Can you just do like a headline 1, headline 2, like how that spin works, describing the very same story? Like what's the like approved narrative versus what would a more honest version be? Well,
I think a perfect example of this was going back to what we were talking about with the Marshall motion to proceed. When Roger Marshall went to the Senate floor and made a rogue motion to proceed, go back and look at the archives of Politico and Punchbowl and see if it's reported on anywhere. And that was a massive story, not just for the politics of it, every Democrat voting against Israel aid and every Senate Republican supporting what the House had just done. But from a process standpoint, this you know, the Capitol Hill press loves this crap, right? Yeah. Like, oh, this, you know, Mitch McConnell's such a genius because he pulled out this, like, you know, legislative maneuver. Well, what Roger Marshall did probably hasn't literally been done in 30 years.
Yeah. In their view, it's practically a second insurrection.
Right. Yeah. And crickets.
Yeah.
And why do you think that was?
Yeah.
McConnell doesn't want members to know that they will be celebrated for doing this. He doesn't want them to know they can do it at all.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, to some extent that antagonistic relationship is fair, right? The leadership doesn't want members going down, just like pulling stuff off the calendar and, you know, holding up the week and all this kind of stuff. I get that. But every now and then, when I think the politics of that vote were so good, it's shocking to me that they didn't trumpet it.
Do you think that the business model of places like Politico and Punchbowl is viable post-McConnell? Like, if we had a conservative leader that didn't allow this sort of thing, do they go out of business? Like,
well, I think it's very funny because they're getting a little bit of that with Mike Johnson. Like, Jake Sherman is incredibly butthurt that the Johnson team. I don't actually know this, but I don't think they talked to him that much. Yeah. Like, he's had a very good relationship with multiple leaders, and he is very proud of that fact. Yeah.
Raj Shah's last job was in the Trump White House. They didn't exactly have a friendly relationship.
Right.
With
And
these
frankly,
guys.
like, I don't know why you would. I mean, they are useful for some things, but like, they are also antagonistic to everything that you stand for. They're not necessarily going to give you a fair shake. So, you know, you can use that access, but it has to be to your benefit. And if they're not going to give you a fair shake, then why would you talk to them? So, you know, post McConnell, you know, I think it just depends on the type of person that replaces him. And there was a quote from McConnell, a couple of months ago. I think the biggest hurdle that anyone replacing him has is to overcome this quote from McConnell, which was effectively, I'm not quoting it perfectly, but it was, you know, I'm not worried about who's going to replace me because all of them are exactly like me. Something to that effect.
Are the frontrunners all exactly like him?
I think that's the case they have to make, because I do think that, you know, the conference is restless. They want some kind of paradigm shift in how the leadership does their job, rather than, you know, doing everything behind closed doors, dropping it on the conference, and then just saying, you need to vote how we tell you. There needs to be a more collaborative environment, a respect for the fact that these are United States senators. They're not kindergartners. They don't wait to be told. They need to be included in the process. Their rights need to be respected. The leadership needs to fight for the rights of their members rather than a minority of them aligning with Democrats to crush the rights of their members. So I think that's going to be the conversation.
Yeah. When did McConnell take over as leader of the Republicans in the Senate?
The years. He's been leader for 16 years. So he's the longest serving Republican leader in history. He broke Mike Mansfield's record.
How many of these senators have even lived under a different regime?
Well, that's kind of going back to what I was saying, that the conference has reached a critical mass of members who have never seen a different way.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's a part of the reason the steering committee exists is to say it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there is another way. Here are 6 strategic options on the floor for you to not have it be this way. And that's one of the key functions the steering committee serves, especially in this moment.
Yeah. And I also get the sense, tell me if you agree with this, that because of the year that's transpired and probably the year to come, the freshman senators next time around are going to really have a choice of what kind of senator they want to be. And there's plenty of fun that it looks like the conservatives are having that is much more attractive than maybe even in years past for them to join on. I mean, it used to be like, you know, Rand and Lee would like do something once in a while, but now it's like there's 6 senators on any given day that might just like overturn the apple cart.
It is no longer Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
There definitely is a class of senator now that, you know, wants to engage in the fight, and the Senate type of senator they've chosen to be is the one that they're allowed to be, right, under the rules. And that's what it was. I said for the last year about my job. You know, as the executive director of the steering committee, there's a number of ways you can frame what the job is, but my number one function is to make their jobs fun.
Yeah.
Right. Because again, it goes with, why would you want to be a U.S. senator?
Yeah.
In this environment? I saw this tweet that, you know, McConnell was recruiting Larry Hogan to run for the seat in Maryland, and he was telling him what life was like in the Senate. And I was like, oh, I'd love to be on the fly on the wall for that conversation. Like, you know, you fly in, You work 2.5 days a week. You get served soft food at the lunches. You wait to get your little order for how to shuffle to the floor and vote on something, and then you go home Thursday after 12.
Yeah.
Like
once a quarter, you can host a crab cakes lunch.
Yeah, right. Like there's got to be more than this, and the most fun that these guys will ever have is on the Senate floor, and that is because that is what they were elected to be, is legislators. And, the glory of the U.S. Senate is that the floor is unscripted. And this doesn't exist in the House. And, I love the House. I also worked in the House. But the Senate, members can make action happen on the Senate floor in so many different ways, in so many different times. And I think it's very telling, going back again to the Marshall motion to proceed, one of the biggest gripes that we got, because leadership hates it when conservatives do this. And to some sense, I get it. But they're like, well, members didn't know there was going to be a vote. And part of me wants to be like, this is the Senate. Like, that's actually how the Senate operates. Yeah. Like, they've become so used to these scheduled times. Yeah. So they know when they can go to their fundraiser. So they know I can do these things because I only have to be on the floor these 3 times a day. That's actually not how the Senate's supposed to operate. It's a very fluid environment. And there's a reason that they all have desks on the Senate floor. It's because they're supposed to be there.
Yeah. Pivoting dramatically, before you went back to the Senate, you developed quite a niche when it came to being, I think, one of the most effective commentators on the conservative case against big tech. We just had this big net choice Supreme Court argument this week. Wither big tech. How goes the fight? Feels like it was largely dormant the year you were in the Senate. What should we be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, the net choice case, there's a couple of big Super Bowl cases coming up for big tech. And I think in the last year, it sort of went dormant because it shifted to the courts, right? The policy argument kind of became entrenched. And so the courts decided to take over. But the net choice v. Paxton argued yesterday in front of the Supreme Court was kind of fascinating because I didn't have a lot of expectations going into the argument, but watching net choice get slapped around for the hubris of how they brought the case. Like, the justices seemed to be very obsessed with the fact that this was a facial challenge to the law, which essentially, the non-lawyer will explain this, I'm sure, very eloquently, but essentially means that this law is unconstitutional in every instance. Every attempt to regulate the big tech companies is unconstitutional and should fail, was essentially the crux of their argument. And the hubris of that argument is kind of stunning, basically saying, you can never regulate us.
Because the cozy zone for these guys is like, well, this is a minor exception, slight differences. And they're like, no.
No, exactly. And I think, where they didn't go in the argument, though, where I would have liked to have seen it go, was actually captured in an amicus brief filed on behalf of the Center for Renewing America by law professor Richard Epstein, where he basically makes the case, because net choice's entire argument is this is a facial challenge because the First Amendment, full stop, right? The First Amendment protects everything we want to do. Epstein's point was, look, this is actually an abuse of market power. These companies are so dominant that they can control access to the marketplace because they are not only speech platforms, right? They are market access platforms. And they can not only distort the entirety of speech in America, they can distort markets themselves. And the court and the policy apparatus has always had an opportunity to fight market distortion. And that has nothing to do with the First Amendment. So that, I think, is a key component of the argument that wasn't really fleshed out yesterday. They tend to focus exclusively on the First Amendment, which is potentially part of this, but I think it's bigger than that. And so I think I don't know what's going to happen with this case. And frankly, it could go very badly, right? If the justices side with net choice, state efforts to blunt the effect of big tech are effectively over, and that would be a very bad outcome.
So what's the lay of the land at the federal level right now? Because the experience that people had during the Trump years, especially during the first administration, was all this squid ink being sprayed by all these right-wing forces, whether in Congress or on the outside, about the fight against big tech. Lina Khan was always a very convenient, like, oh, any attempt to regulate big tech means you are Lina Khan and bad. What's the actual lay of the land right now in terms of the relative power that the anti-big tech forces have in DC versus the pro-big tech ones?
So I think that, on the money side, the deck is always with big tech.
Yeah.
And that's not only do they sort of spread corporate money around to the outside groups, but they also have conflicted out every major law firm in this city, right? So that's been a problem for sort of fighting the court battles,
including the conservative boutique firms.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a handful that are not. But
who's arguing the case for net choice?
Paul Clement. Yeah. Right. But he got slapped around a little bit yesterday. Yeah. So I think that institutionally and financially, big tech owns this argument. I think on the policy side, in Congress, I think it's been tough. And these are issues I did not obviously work on when I was on the steering committee. But I think it's been tough for Republicans to find common ground with Democrats because Democrats are just so committed to this misinformation narrative. Mm-hmm. And they actually enjoy the fact that Facebook and Google, and they probably think that Gemini, Google's AI that will not depict a white person, is a revolution in AI. So I think there's been a little bit of trouble finding common ground on some of this stuff. But where there has been progress is on child safety and what these platforms can do around the kind of content they show kids, mm-hmm. but also the data mining on children. The COPPA, the federal law that governs how you can treat a minor online is woefully out of date. You have Google handing out Chromebooks for free, right, to every public school to clientize your child.
Yeah.
And the courts have said, oh, well, the school can consent on behalf of the parent, right, for how that child is then tracked across the internet. So I think there is a lot of actual bipartisan concern around those issues, which, if that's the jumping off point for getting to the rest of it, I don't think it's nearly as comprehensive as it needs to be, but that's a good starting point.
Yeah. What do you think the opportunities are going to be if we do get unified control? Like in the overlapping Venn diagram of the good and the possible, what could federal action look like?
I would love to see it be legislative. I think that's going to take a long mm-hmm. time. I do think that some of these actions are already being pursued, right? The Trump DOJ filed that major antitrust lawsuit against Google, which is going to be working its way through the courts for years.
Is the Biden administration actually prosecuting it?
They have been following up on that case, yes. So that's still ongoing. And I frankly think that it's actions like that that are going to have the most resonance. Mm-hmm. I don't know. My hope for Congress is kind of low on this issue, mm-hmm. as probably most Americans feel about their Congress. But if, Congress could solve this problem with, how they treat these platforms as market actors, mm-hmm. because I think that is the locus of their power. Mike Lee, who was my boss in the Senate, who is the ranking member on the antitrust subcommittee, has two specific bills on this question that deal with how the platforms manipulate the market, which is the crux of their power over speech. And that, I think, is the approach that makes the most sense, frankly. Mm-hmm. So, and I think, because I think also the big tech companies' First Amendment jurisprudence is a tough, row to hoe for the rest of us. Why are we not focusing on the market power? Because the speech issues are downstream of that.
Yeah. Does do the appointments that the next Republican president makes play a big role here? Do you get any sense that there's any appetite to put more interesting people at the FCC and FTC?
Yeah, I think FCC, FTC, and DOJ and the antitrust division all play a critical role here. I think Trump's appointments, were good on this. When you had Brendan Carr at the FCC, you had Macon Del Rahim at DOJ. I think they did a lot of spade work for the Trump's efforts to take on big tech. But you have to put very thoughtful people in these roles, because you don't want the pendulum to swing too far, right? There is a vision in which you go full, right, Brandeisian to the other side, which I think a lot of Republicans disagree with for good reason. But I think that the way the pendulum is on the right now, which is just full, sort of narrowly tailored Borkian libertarianism, is not effective in this area either. And I think it's, almost an ahistorical interpretation of how the statute should be applied anyway.
Yeah. When it comes to one of the concepts that I've learned from you over the years, it's like the most plausible opportunities that we tend to have are on must-pass legislation or stuff that's going to pass anyway. And so it seems like to me that because of the AI boom, there's going to be bills relating to big tech that there's going to be significant momentum on moving anyway? Do you think that those AI bills, whatever they might be, are going to be the locus of opportunity to actually attach some good stuff legislatively, or is the AI stuff going to hurt us more than it helps us?
I think it depends on who's writing it. I mean, what the Democrats want to do, and Chuck Schumer has made AI a priority.
Shivers.
I know. And he would bring in all these like, members only briefings on AI with, trotting in various people to talk about equity in AI and then say there's no questions allowed from the senators. Like it was very odd. Yeah. But, depending on who's writing it, whatever they put out, I think is going to be terrible. So it's almost a question of, if that's the bill, then your priority is to kill it. Right. But if you get something that's like acceptable, then yes, I think the price of admission for that should be, okay, we have to control the rest of it too. And, we've had a lot of existing bills out there at this point. What are the priorities for Republicans on this issue? What are those bills going to look like? I do think that there is a role to play too on the government funding bills about what these agencies can do with this money. CISA, the information office that basically within DHS that basically, controlled with the platforms, worked hand in glove essentially with them to take down content. Like they don't need new legislation to fix that problem. It is just either not voting for the spending bill that funds it or turning it off in the spending bill. So there are things they can do too, like right now. And that's, the funding fight that we're living in right now. There's a lot of consternation about the fact that Republicans are not doing those things and they're going to vote for these bills anyway.
Yeah. We're going to move on now to our members only segment where we talk about all sorts of topics of various interest that are a little bit more lighthearted or much more dark-hearted, I guess. Rachel is one of the most accomplished sommeliers in DC, so we're going to talk a little
slightly overstating it, but
we're going to talk a little bit about that as well as her doomsday predictions for the future. There's a banana story that Nick wants to tell. Both Nick and
that
Rachel
you asked me to
are
tell.
going to have 2 under 2, and so as the childless Zoomer here, I'm just going to listen for some of that. So you can go to our YouTube and subscribe as either a truther or a statesman, and that gets you the episode 24 hours early on Sundays. It gives you access to special members only content like this, special events we're going to be hosting in DC, and much, much more. So be sure to subscribe on YouTube. We'll go now to our members only segment. Rachel, why? If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Rachel, how can everyone keep up with everything that you're doing now that you're allowed to have a public presence again? Although you never really stopped, your Twitter was quite active the entire time.
It was restrained.
Yeah.
I felt it was restrained.
Yeah. About as restrained as Senator Lee's private Twitter account is. But
yes, if you're not following Based Mike Lee, you're really missing out.
How did that happen?
I was not present at the creation, so I don't know. But I will say it is a Twitter account that he personally enjoys very much.
Well, is it like, because it's interesting, right? Because like there's all these like lies that we tell ourselves in politics. Like, for instance, nothing that is in a fundraising email is ever actually taken seriously as news. Like if it was, then every day it'd be like, Nancy Pelosi admits that the Democrats are going to lose the election if you don't donate $5 right now. Like it's just not a thing. And it's like, okay, so you have your like buttoned up official account that has the flag picture and everything. And that's what, one of the Senate accounts. And then there's the campaign account, and that's the slightly more political one. And it's like, but Senator Lee created a third one.
Well, there are members like who they're few and far between, but there are members that do tweet for themselves.
Right. So Senator Vance tweets for himself.
Yeah. Vance tweet Congressman Chip Roy.
Yeah.
Like runs his personal Twitter. Yeah. Chuck Grassley, as we all know, runs his personal Twitter. So there are some of them that do tweet, but for themselves.
But how can people follow you?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Rachel Bovard. I also write the weekly Compass newsletter here at CPI, and I'm, just settling back in. So I'm sure
this is your first interview.
Yes, it is.
Hopefully it'll break news.
Oh my gosh, not in a bad way.
Yeah.
But I'll probably start, writing for various publications again as soon as I get my wits about me.
Well, Rachel, thank you for coming back on the podcast, and we're glad to see you outside of that godforsaken building and back in the real world.
I enjoyed my time in the U.S. Capitol nursing home, but I'm happy to be back. Happy to be back at CPI.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Hopefully you enjoyed that. We certainly did. As always, we're huge fans of Rachel, so keep an eye on what she's doing now that she's back IRL. Her Twitter account is still pretty choppy and fun, so highly recommend going and following that. Again, join us at the Gala for American Statecraft here in just a couple days, americanmoment.org/gala. Sign up for AM Fridays, our spring lecture series on Capitol Hill, free Chick-fil-A. That's americanmoment.org/AM Fridays. Be sure to rate and review this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube and become a member. Become a truther or a statesman to get this episode 24 hours early and get the special members only content. And be sure to tune in next week for yet another episode of Moment of Truth. We're coming up on 150 episodes here. It's absolutely crazy how long we've just been blabbing into these cameras. I'm sure that half of this is going to end up compromat one day, but we do it for the fans. We do it for the grind. We'll see you guys next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.